We are very eager to hear from Andrew Billingsley tonight. He's a fascinating author. His story is one that I don't think is widely known. It was not to me, and I think it is a fascinating story. So we've asked Mae Gentry to introduce him. Mae, as you probably know, those of you that have lived in Atlanta, she has written for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for the last 23 years now. She is writing a book on her own, and Andrew Billingsley is her mentor in writing that. So please join me in welcoming Mae Gentry.
Thank you. Dr. Andrew Billingsley is a senior scholar in residence at the Institute for Families in Society and professor of sociology and African American studies at the University of South Carolina. Past career highlights include service as emeritus professor and former chair of family studies at the University of Maryland, president of Morgan State University, and vice president for academic affairs at Howard University. A former Fulbright scholar to Ghana, Dr. Billingsley is the author of several books of sociology, including the seminal work Black Families in White America. Other books include Climbing Jacob's Ladder, The Enduring Legacy of African American Families, Children of the Storm, and Mighty Like a River, The Black Church and Social Reform. His most recent publication is Yearning to Breathe Free, Robert Smalls of South Carolina and His Families, published by USC Press. I'd like to read one of the blurbs from the back of the book. This is by Lawrence S. Rowland, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of South Carolina, Beaufort. From his sensational escape with the planter in 1862, through his combat service in the Civil War, to his bold and implacable political leadership in the face of threatening opposition in Reconstruction South Carolina, Robert Smalls was an American hero in the truest sense of the word. Billingsley's new biography goes beyond describing the dramatic events of Smalls' public life. It explains the remarkable character behind them. In this manuscript, Dr. Billingsley offers the first biography of the Civil War hero to assess the deep influence of Smalls' families, black and white, past and present, on his life and enduring legend. In doing so, he creates a compelling mosaic of evolving black-white social relations in the South, as exemplified by this famous figure and his descendants. And now it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Andrew Billingsley.
First, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out this evening to help me bring the Robert Smalls story more alive as a historic representation of the African American people. I want to thank Mae Gentry for that lovely introduction, Mae. Thank you. Mae and I have been friends for a time, and I knew her mother and her children, and I'm privileged to be one of the mentors for a fellowship she's received at the University of South Carolina to write this new book she's going to do about her relatives, the distinguished artists, Elise Harrelson, who was a photographer, and Edwin Harrelson, who was a painter and a civic leader and a businessman. And I'm especially eager to read all of those love letters between them when they were apart. They're 10 or 12 or more. And I read some of them. They're just fascinating. So I'm looking forward to the time when I can come back here to the Carter Center to introduce Mae Gentry to describe her new book on the house. I'm also grateful to Tony Clark for welcoming me here and for Bill Starr, who welcomed me here to meet with the Center for the Book, and the others of you who have come too. Just thank you for coming, and I'd like to say a few words about the book, and then I'll take your questions. And if you're still with me, I'll sign your copies until then. Let me ask first, how many people know the story of Robert Smalls? Let me see. That's good, about half. I mean, the rest of you will surely have to buy the book. Yearning to Breathe Free. Robert Smalls of South Carolina and his families. There are some other books about Robert Smalls. There's a book written in 1996 by Edward Miller called Gullah Statesman. There's a book written in 1971 by Okon Edet Uye, a Nigerian scholar who published his book in 1971. And then Dorothy Sterling wrote a book about Captain of the Planter, the story of Robert Smalls, back in 1958, and hers was the first biography of Robert Smalls. Now, I've just told you about 3 biographies already, right? So somebody asked me when I was telling them about doing this book, why do you need to write another book about Robert Smalls? There have already been 3 books written about him. I said, how many books have there been written about Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Wade Hampton? Sometimes you need another look at the situation, and I think there needs to be another look at the Robert Smalls story, and so here I go. Actually, at that time, I thought there was a need for one more book, which the one I was writing and is here right now finished. But now that I've finished this book, I think there's a need for one more book that I hope my students or some of the descendants of Smalls will write in the next few years. Okay. On May 13th, 1862, 1 year into the U.S. Civil War, 23-year-old Robert Smalls, who had been held in slavery all his life, captured a Confederate warship, the Planter, steered it out of Charleston Harbor, past 5 armed Confederate checkpoints without being fired upon. He steered it past Fort Sumter and delivered the ship to the Union Navy that was patrolling the South Atlantic to keep any Confederate ships from coming out and going to do trade in Europe. So he delivered this ship to the Union Navy. Now, this abduction of the Planter was the first of many episodes in Smalls' incessant yearning to breathe free. Sometimes later, during an audience he had with President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton, Smalls regaled the president with his recitation of his abduction of the Planter. But when the president asked him, why did he do it, Smalls looked at the president and said simply, freedom. And President Lincoln, who was deeply enmeshed at the time in his own struggle for a new breath of freedom, understood Smalls' mission. Smalls served the Union throughout the war, engaging in more than 17 battles, voyages, and combat missions. And during the war, after the war, he returned to Beaufort, where he was elected to the Constitutional Conventions of 1868, which gave black men the right to vote, and the Constitutional Convention of 1895, which took away the rights of black men to vote. Smalls was there arguing to maintain these rights, and he lost that battle. He died at the age of 76 in the Prince Street house where he had grown up as a house slave, owned by his masters. After the war, he had some money, and his owners did not have. They had lost all of their property, including him. So Smalls bought the house for his family But then he looked out for the McKee family because they had been kind to him and his mother during slavery. And so he bought a little house with them out on the edge of town with some space for gardening so they could care for themselves. He got a job for their daughter in Washington. He did a lot of things to help this family. He introduced legislation to try to get the federal government to reimburse the McKee family for their losses during the war, but that didn't pass. And so his house now is called the Robert Smalls House, established as such in 1796. The citizens of Beaufort County have paid honor to Smalls and his legacy in numerous ways. For a time, there existed simultaneously the Robert Smalls Elementary School, the Robert Smalls High School, and the Robert Smalls Junior High School, all in the same complex of buildings. Now, it's not that the citizens of Beaufort couldn't think of anything else to name their schools. They just couldn't think of anybody else who was more worthy to have schools named after them. Education was one of Smalls' strongest passions, and I'll tell you some more about that. Today, the current Robert Smalls Middle School follows in that same tradition. Then a section of Highway 170 leading into Beaufort is called the Robert Smalls Parkway. In 1976, the South Carolina governor, Republican Governor James Edwards, in 1976, issued a proclamation naming February 22, 1976, as Robert Smalls Day in the whole state of South Carolina, honoring a man who, he said, quote, born in slavery, exemplifies a man who, through devotion to his state and people, and by constant faith in himself, rose above his environment to play an instrumental role in the nation's history. The governor was prompted, no doubt, by Smalls' descendants and the citizens of Beaufort County who had gathered the previous day to name a bust in honor of Smalls. And since 1984, Smalls' descendants have been having biannual family reunions to keep alive the legacy. And then on September the 15th, the month after next, I have been invited, and you are all hereby invited, to Baltimore, because in the Baltimore Harbor, the U.S. Army will launch its newest transport ship called the Major General Robert Smalls. So all of us will be there to celebrate that occasion. As I told you, Smalls was committed to education above all else. His son was asked 40 or so years later, what does he think his father's major contribution was? And he didn't mention any of the political stuff, any of the military stuff. He said, I think his major contribution was in education. What did Smalls do in education that would make such an important? Well, I'll tell you what he did. He was not taught to read and write when he was enslaved. And so after the war, he hired a tutor to come to his house to teach him the basics. And he'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, study for 2 hours. At 7 o'clock, the tutor would come and spend an hour with him. And that's all the education he ever got for 6 months. But he was a very learned man, as you can tell. Education was his passion. Not only that, he founded a school in Beaufort for the ex-slaves, and he became chairman of the county school board. Never been inside a school a day in his life, but they elected him chairman of the school board. I suppose because, not only because he was famous as a war hero, but because he was rich. And he probably put up the money for the building, and so that's why they made him chairman of the board. He was always doing things like that. And then later he introduced a resolution in 1868 to create the first free compulsory schools in the history of the state of South Carolina, or in the history of the South, for black or white kids. The first public schools introduced by Robert Smalls. The next year, the legislature passed it, and he was appointed chairman of the committee to implement it. And we got our first public schools in South Carolina because of this unschooled Robert Smalls. He also had a passion for education when, after the war, before the war, the University of South Carolina closed down because all of the students left to join the Confederate forces, so they couldn't have any university. After the war, when Robert Smalls was the leader of the Republican majority in the state, they appointed a biracial school board for the first time. And that school board opened up the university. So the University of South Carolina became the first public university in the South to be open to black and white students alike. It was a marvelous achievement and great accomplishment. I didn't know about this part of Small's legacy until I came down here. But there were a lot of people who went to the law school and graduated. A lot of blacks went to the college and graduated. One young man who went to that college was Hannibal Kershaw. I'll tell you about Hannibal Kershaw because it's a fantastic story, but I have problems with it, which I'll also tell you about. Kershaw went to this college, the university, and he was a very bright student, especially in the classics. So when his professor left South Carolina to go to Iowa to have a tenured professorship at Grinnell College in Iowa, he took Kershaw with him. Kershaw was brilliant. He graduated and became, in 1879, the first African-American to graduate from Grinnell College in Iowa. He came back to South Carolina and taught and went into the ministry. Now, that's a wonderful story for you all, but for me it has some problems with it. It says he graduated from Grinnell College, the first African-American to do so, in 1879. Now, when I graduated from Grinnell College in 1951, I thought I was the first African-American to graduate from the college. So this young man has reached up from the grave and stolen my legacy. I'm going to have to change my resume. But education was a strong feature. They eventually opened South Carolina State University. He was also a strong entrepreneur, private businessman, but his heart belonged to public service. He was trustee for the school, for a public school in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was director of the Prudence Fire Engine Company. He was a member and vice president of the Board of Regents of the State Normal School. That's a school for teachers. He was regent of the State Lunatic Asylum. He was long active in the state militia. He was a member of the Lincoln Republican Guard, lieutenant colonel of the 3rd Regiment of the 1st Brigade, 1st Division. He was brigadier general of the 1st Brigade, 1st Division, and major general at the top of the level in the state militia. One time when he was major general in the state militia, they had a strike at the rice plantation. They'd hired the former slaves to work on the rice plantation, but they weren't paying them in money. They were paying them in scrip, paper money that could only be used at the company store. So the rice workers had a strike. They said this wasn't right. Since they were free now, they didn't have to do that. It was an election year, so the governor got very nervous about a strike because a number of white men came to break up the strike on horseback with rifles. So there was about to be a major confrontation. So the governor asked Robert Smalls to go down to the rice conflict and see if he could settle it. And Robert Smalls went down, and although he was a major general in the National Guard, he did not take his weapon. He just walked in between these two warring factions and talked to them reasonably, explaining to the white riders that they surely did not want to kill these people just because they were on strike. That would be very bad. And then he went back and talked to the strikers and explained to them, maybe we can get something for you, but maybe not everything. And anyhow, 7 of these rice workers had been arrested already and told to turn themselves in to the sheriff. They said they had gone looking for the sheriff, turned themselves in, but they couldn't find him. So Smalls said, okay, tell you what you do. I want you to walk 17 miles to Beaufort, where there is a sheriff, and turn yourself into that sheriff. And these 7 men did that. Just voluntarily did it, wandering through the woods. That was Robert Smalls, fantastic guy. But the question is, for my book, I tell this whole story, and there's more to it if you have time to ask some questions later on. But the question is, how was Smalls able to do all these things? Now, it's clear that if he had not captured the planter, we wouldn't know his name today, and I wouldn't be writing this book, and you wouldn't be here ready to buy copies. But if his owners had not taken him to Charleston for the last 12 years before the war, where he learned so much from Charleston and the ocean and the sea, that he got ready to do his work in the Navy. And even before that, he was prepared by his early childhood socialization to do great things. What do I mean by that? Socialization, that means rearing, child rearing. He was raised by his mother. And although he was enslaved, and she was enslaved, she was a favorite house servant of the McKees family. And she had served them, by the time he was born, she had served them for 30, 35 years. And there's a very close bond between her and the family. And she was permitted to keep him around the house with her as he grew older, doing house chores and errands. And he wouldn't have to be assigned to the field until he turned 12 years old. That means this kid was raised by his mother every day. They slept in the same cabin, and she taught him lots of stuff. She taught him to be brave. She taught him to treat people well. She taught him to respect himself. She told him that you are as good as anybody else, and he believed it. But he was also enslaved, and so she told him, we may be treated well by the McKees family for the time being, but that could be temporary. Since we were enslaved, at any time he could sell us to somebody who wouldn't be kind to us. So be aware that we're enslaved and follow the rules. But she had also told him that he was as good as anybody else, right? So he was allowed to play with the neighborhood kids. He was allowed to play with the McKees children, though they were white, and one was a girl. They were allowed to play together. And he was allowed to play with the white boys in the neighborhood. So sometimes when he'd be out in the around the neighborhood playing with his white friends, 7 o'clock would come, and 7 o'clock was curfew time. And the bell on the jail would ring. And that meant all the black people had to go inside. But the white people didn't. So Small said, look at here. Something's wrong with this picture. I have to go inside. I can't stay out playing with my friends, but they don't have to go inside. That is not fair, he said. So he grew up to hate that bell. Once in a while, because his mother had told him he was as good as anybody else, he would decide that he was on a given night, and he would stay out after the bell rung. The police would come and pick him up, put him inside the jail, and notify his owner that Smalls has done it again. The owner, Henry McKee, would come down and get Smalls out of jail and tell him don't do it again, knowing full well that in due course, Smalls would do it again. He was torn between being as good as anybody else and being a slave, and he didn't like the being a slave part. Now, in 1947, I told you about these 4 books that have been written about Smalls, but most of them are about Smalls and his accomplishments. And my point of my book is that Smalls didn't do all these things by himself. He had some help. He had some support. He had some facilitation. And he had these families. My book is called Robert Smalls of South Carolina and His Families. What do I mean by family? Well, family to me means 2 or more people who are related to each other by marriage or by blood or by adoption or by ancestry or by commission, but who are related to each other and who are responsible to each other and for each other. This is the key. Family members are responsible for each other and responsible to each other. So keep that definition in mind as I go through listing some of these things which I call families, which some of you might not call a family. But since you're listening to me about my book, you have to put up with my definition of family. I wrote this definition in 1968, and it has been elaborated since through the years, but it hasn't changed basically. You don't have to be a married couple to be a family. You don't have to be a child of another person to be family. You got to have a sense of belonging to each other and responsibility for each other. That grows out of the African American experience. Now, other people do it too, but but let me just list you some of Small's families. The first family is his mother and himself. That was a family. It was a nuclear family. Now, it's only 2 people, but some people say you got to have third person to be a family. But no, I say in the African American experience, 2 people can be a family if they have these essential ingredients of bonding and belonging to each other. He also had a brother, an older brother, which other writers have not discovered. One of my discoveries, not many, but I discovered that. He had an older brother. And he had a grandmother who taught his mother some stuff that she taught him. So he had some relatives as he was growing up. And because his mother was able to raise him, that was a very important institution for him. I told you that his mother taught him that slavery was wrong. And sometimes he didn't appreciate that, so she would take him when there was a slave being whipped to see it, what slavery was really like. So she took him one time to see a young woman being whipped. And when the young woman was finished being whipped, she fell to the ground, and he saw her face, and she was a friend of his. And the descendants said that Smalls wept all the way back home because his friend was being subjected to such cruelty. Another time, his mother persuaded the owner to let Smalls go to the plantation for the weekend so he could learn about what slavery is really like. So Smalls went to the plantation that weekend, and unfortunately for this plan, another slave man came into the cabin that night with a copy of a speech written by Frederick Douglas. And he read that speech to all of the people. And young 9 or 10-year-old Robert Smalls heard that speech. When he got back home, he said, "Mom, you know, I heard about Frederick Douglas. And when I grow up, I want to be a man like Frederick Douglas." And he was. And he and Frederick Douglass were friends and fellow Republican leaders. But that's one family. The second family I write about a lot in this book is the McKee family, the people who owned Robert Smalls. The McKee family were his family too. Why? Well, partly because he lived in the same house with them, partly because he stayed for 12 years and played with their children, and partly because the owner allowed him to stay around the house with his mother for the first 12 years, and partly because the owner was just good to him in so many ways. They were family. In Beaufort, South Carolina, where Smalls was born and buried, he's buried in the Tabernacle Church Cemetery, a few hundred feet from the Episcopal Church Cemetery where the McKee family is buried. These 2 families, the Smalls and the McKees, just a few hundred feet apart. And I say of that means that these 2 families are almost as close in death as they were in life. In life, they were extremely close. I'll tell you some more about the McKee family. But then there's another family that was important to Smalls in his life. When they sent him to Charleston at age 12 to work on the docks to make money, he was working on the dock and they paid him $15 a month, and he gave it to the owner because it belonged to the owner. But I told you the McKees were kind to them, right? So what McKee did, whenever he got his $15, he gave Smalls a part of the money. How much do you suppose he gave him? $1. He gave Smalls $1. Smalls didn't fret. He saved his dollar. He didn't do what some of us today, like Miss Gentry might do with a little extra money. He didn't go shoe store shopping for. He saved it. And then he bought stuff. He bought vegetables, and he sold those vegetables to the men on the dock. I told you he worked on the dock, and men came there from all over the world. And he sold these vegetables and fruits and stuff to them and made more money. And he bought more vegetables and fruits, and he sold it to them. And he made lots of money, and he saved it up. In time, Smalls started a family in Charleston while he was growing up. And the young lady that caught his eye was 30 years old, and he was 17, and they got married. At first, for the first few months they courted, they went everywhere together because they were both allowed to wander around on their own to do their work. Later, Smalls purchased his wife's freedom while he was still a slave. And he purchased her for $800, except when he offered to purchase her from her owner, the owner said, "I'll sell it to you for $800. Smalls said, "Well, I don't have that much, but I got $100. Can you imagine this? An enslaved 17-year-old got $100. I don't know where he kept it. You couldn't have a bank account, Maybe he kept it under the mattress. So the owner said, okay, her owner said, okay, give me the $100 and give me the $700 when you get it. So I know you're industrious, you're hardworking, and you'll make the money, and so give it to me when you get it. So for the next few years, his wife and husband worked extra work to make extra money to save it up. And in a few years, they had the $700 saved up. But they decided, since it was all about freedom, not to give the $700 to the owner, but to take it with them as a nest egg when they escaped on the planter. So when they went into freedom with the planter, they took with them $700 as a nest egg. And then he got paid $50 a month for being on the pilot. And then one time he became captain, he got paid $150 a month. He saved his money. And so when he got back to Beaufort, he bought this house and some other things. That was a tight family. Let me tell you how tight that family was. When Smalls and his men who were working on the ship together decided that the time was right this next weekend for us to make our move, because they knew the habits of the owners. The three owners, the three white officers, would periodically leave the ship in the hands of the slaves, and they would go on shore overnight with their families. So Smalls, they worked out this plan. So Smalls explained the plan to all the other 8 men. He said, this means, however, that if we're caught, we will probably be shot. So I suggest, said Smalls, he's now 23 years old, I suggest that if we're caught by the Confederate forces, we should set fire to the dynamite and blow the ship up, and ourselves too. Better to take our lives into our own hands than to turn ourselves over to the Confederates. So all the men agreed to do that plan except one. One asked to be excused, and Smalls said, okay, just don't tell our secret. Then Smalls turned to his wife, Hannah, who'd been planning with him for the last 12 years about freedom. He said, you know, Hannah, I know we've been planning to go, but this is really dangerous. I might be killed. Or we might kill ourselves. So perhaps you and the children should stay back behind. And then when I get to freedom, I will surely come back and get you. What do you suppose she'd said? Anybody know the Old Testament in the Bible? The story of Ruth and her mother-in-law. How Ruth pledged that she would stay together with her mother-in-law after all the men had died. Your people will be my people. Where you go, I will go. Anyhow, that's a Bible story. But this young, unschooled woman turned to her husband after a while and said, you know, I will go. And where you die, I will die. And so it was. Now, I want to know how many women in the audience tonight would be willing to go with their husband wherever he go. Where he die, you will die. I don't see many hands. When I asked my wife this question, she said, maybe. But they all went. She went, she took their 2 children. She took one of her own children, who was his stepchild, and there were 8 of the men on the boat. They all became family. And they made this dangerous trip together as family. But I want to come back to Smalls after the war. There are several different kinds of families I describe in the book, and all of them have these fantastic stories to them. But I want to come to the McKees family after the war. I told you that before the war, the McKees owned the Smalls. After the war, Smalls was wealthy, and the McKees were in need, and so he helped them. he got jobs for their children. He recommended one of the McKees to the military academy. He just did lots of things. And then, when the old man died, in 1875, old man McKee died, and Mrs. McKee was left. She lived a long time after that, but she became old and ill. And what do you suppose Smalls did? He went and got her, brought her into his house, which used to be her house, put her up in the best room of the house, which was his room, which used to be her room. He had the servants take care of her every need, except one, breakfast. Breakfast he insisted on delivering to her himself. She fussed at him one time. She said, Robert, you should not be making so much fuss over me. I mean, after all, you're an important man now. You congressman and you're general, and you shouldn't do that. The servants can do whatever needs to be done around here. And this is what he said to her. He said, Madam, when I was your slave in this very house, and much more dependent than you are now, you took pretty good care of me. And now it's my turn. I will do no less for you. What a man. What an example for us today. I want to close this McKee chapter by reading to you from the book after Smalls got into trouble after the war. He was an important political leader, right? But he got into trouble because he was accused, at the end of Reconstruction, he was accused of having taken a bribe 4 years earlier, and they brought him to trial, and they convicted him, and they sentenced him to 3 years in the penitentiary, but he was out on bond, pending appeal. It was a rough time for Smalls. And then a number of citizens began to raise money to put up for his clemency. And Wade Hampton was governor now, Wade Hampton of the red shirts, and he was a mean man for these black Republicans especially. But the McKee family came to Smalls' aid. And I want to read you this story, written by one of the McKee family members, W.B. McKee, who owned a railroad program in Savannah, not far from Charleston. He wrote to Governor Wade Hampton, and he said, Robert Smalls belonged to my father's nephew, John McKee. He was raised in our family as a houseboy. Always proved himself. This is the McKee descendant writing to the governor about Smalls and pointing out that they grew up together. I should also tell you that this McKee person who was writing this letter on behalf of Smalls fought in the Confederacy, of course. He went to the Citadel and he graduated. He was an officer in the Confederacy. Smalls was an officer in the Union fleet. But this is now 2 weeks after the war. And these two childhood friends meet. Let me tell you how they meet. Robert Smalls belonged to my father's nephew and so forth. I lost track of him during the war. But within 2 weeks after the war, this McKee is writing now, within 2 weeks after the war, I visited my native place, Beaufort, and I'd taken sick there. And I was convalescing, sitting on the porch of a store owned by a friend of mine in Beaufort. So here he is now, just 2 weeks after the war, coming back to Beaufort and sitting on the porch of his friend. When Smalls, then the captain of the planter, met me, he greeted me with all the welcome that he would have extended to me in the days of our boyhood when we played together. And then, listen to this. McKee is just writing to the governor. Noting that I had on a Confederate gray jacket Small said to me, "You might want to know that today is payday, and there are 2 companies of black Union troops patrolling this area. And if they see you with a Confederate jacket on, that might be unpleasant." And then Small said to him, McKees writing, then, in the most delicate way, Smalls asked me if I would permit him to buy a new coat and present it to me, and I was glad to do it. And it gave Smalls as much pleasure as it did me. See this? How the tables are turned, and yet kindness, and I call this family. Now, there's some descendants of Smalls who quarrel with me about some of my definitions of family, but since you're not descendants, I hope, you just listen politely, even if you don't agree. So that was fantastic coming together. These boys had fought on different sides of the war, but now they were back, and they were going to be family again. Let me close my remarks by telling you one final story about Robert Smalls. He was considered a great man in Beaufort. And I've told you all sorts of awards he received. About the ship being named after him, there was a Navy training program named Robert Smalls. Smalls' great-grandson studied in that institute, and his son was a commencement speaker. A lot of family stuff, right? So, but all these honors, none equals the honor paid to Smalls by 2 ordinary citizens of Beaufort. It was just after Smalls had been elected to his first term in the Congress. He was home in Beaufort, walking down the street. These 2 guys saw him walking down the street, and one said to the other, "You know, I think that Robert Smalls is just about the greatest man that ever lived. Don't you agree?" Second man said, "Well, I think Smalls is great, all right, but I wouldn't say he's the greatest man that ever lived." The first man was insulted by this. Who could possibly be greater than Robert Smalls? He wanted to know from the second man. Second man said, "Jesus Christ." First man said, "Well, okay, you got me there. But just remember, Smalls is still a young man yet." That's how his neighbors looked up on him. I'll stop now to see if you have any questions about the Robert Smalls story, and I'll try to answer them. Yes?
Is there anything known about Robert Smalls' father and his relationship with his father?
Nobody knows who Smalls' father was. Everybody who writes about it says that they don't know, that there's no historical records. And nobody has quoted any direct testimony from Robert Smalls or his mother. And yet, everybody who writes about this begins there and then proceeds to talk about who it probably was or might have been. Most people think it was John McKee, Lydia's owner. I don't think so. Because, scholars are funny. They really need documents, but sometimes they go with just oral reports, rumors. Now, I'm a sociologist. I don't have to have documents, right? The descendants can tell me 2 or 3 stories, and I'll put it in the book. But I was skeptical about these 3 men who had been recommended as Smalls' father, and I got the goods on John McKee, because when a young 13-year-old boy took me to visit the McKees Cemetery in the church in Beaufort, I noticed that John McKee died in 1835. And a few feet down the way, in the cemetery where Smalls was born, you can tell he was born in 1839. You don't have to be moral about that. It's a biological impossibility. You know the story about Thomas Jefferson, how people used to say he couldn't be Sally Hemings' lover and father of her children because it would be a moral impossibility. Well, you don't need to be moral about this story. That's a biological impossibility. He was dead before the guy was born. And then there's another guy they say might have been his father, and he lived in Charleston, and I disqualify him. Because a lot of people think that Smalls lived in Charleston, because that's where he stole the boat. But he didn't. He was born in Beaufort. Anyhow, I dismiss him. I dismiss all of them. And then I come to Henry McKee. Henry McKee now was Smalls' master. Henry McKee inherited Smalls and his mother after Henry McKee's father died. So it could have been. They were together all the time since she was 15 years old when he was born, and they've been in the same house all this time, so it could have been. But I don't think so. And I go into a great deal about that. However, I conclude that while Henry McKee might not have been Smalls' biological father, because the evidence is not there, he was most assuredly Smalls' sociological father. There's plenty of evidence. He is the man who took care of Smalls. He is the man who allowed Smalls to stay around the house for 12 years. He's the man who taught Smalls how to hunt and how to fish and how to shoot with a gun. And he's the man who took care of Smalls and taught Smalls all sorts of stuff and protected him. Isn't that what a father was supposed to do? Well, Smalls didn't have any father to do that for him, but he had this sociological father who looked after him. And so, after the war, Smalls would do the same. So the answer to your question is, I don't know who his father is, but I got 3 or 4 pages where I discuss the matter, and I conclude that Henry McKee is my man for sociological reasons. Some people think that Smalls' father was white because Smalls was smart. And that's why, that's a secret. His father was white. But I don't think that. I think he's smart because his mother raised him. That's what I think. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Was there a step-family, a step-child involved with his wife?
Yes.
Older than he?
Yes. There were stepchildren. When Smalls was 17 and got married to Hannah, who was 30, she already had 2 children, aged 12 and 14, 2 girls. So 14, 15, 16, 17, he was only 3 years older than his new stepdaughter. But the oldest member of these descendants, the only one who ever knew Smalls personally, told me several years ago that Smalls made no difference between these children who were his stepchildren and those who were his own children. They were part of the family. And that's the point I make. He brought one of those kids with him on the boat when he escaped. After the war, the other girl came to live with them in Beaufort, and then their children became part of the family. Family. I make a big case out of that. However, these children of Hannah's daughters went on and got married to an English sea captain that Smalls introduced her to in Beaufort. And you know that Smalls made a big thing about interracial marriage in the Constitutional Convention. He wasn't against that. He was against interracial cohabitation with white men and black women. And so he made a motion that this should be banned. He was against interracial marriage, he said, but also this cohabitation where these white men were having babies by these black women, that the children should have the last name of the father and should have inheritance rights of the father. So they voted that down in the Constitutional Convention. But these stepchildren of his were children. And these stepchildren went to school because Smalls thought school was important. And when the first black college, public college, was opened in South Carolina, Smalls had campaigned for it in the Constitutional Convention. Smalls' daughter was one of the first teachers, and Smalls' baby son now went to this kindergarten there. And all of the stepchildren went to South Carolina State and graduated. I have the names, all the names in the book, and the year they graduated. It's a fantastic story. And this institution became the gateway for the black middle class in South Carolina during the early years of the 20th century. Yes, sir.
Couple questions. Number one, what position, what rank did he attain during the Civil War?
He attained the rank of captain during the war. But after the war, he joined the militia, the State Guard, and then he went all the way up and became Major General. Want me to tell you a little bit more about this captain during the war? Because I was hesitating on that.
Yes.
Let me tell you how it was. Smalls was when he captured the ship and they accepted the ship and they accepted him. Some story, and he tells that he was inducted into the Army because he couldn't join the Navy because he didn't know how to read and write. But the Navy wanted him, so he was inducted into the Army, and the Army assigned him on duty to the Navy. So he piloted Navy ships throughout the war. He was a pilot, and they paid him $50 a month, which is good money. They also paid him $1,500 for turning in the planter. Then one day he was out on a mission. He was piloting the planter, and the white officer who was in charge, well, the planter came under fire from the Confederates from atop a bluff, and the Confederate cannon tore the roof off the planter. And the white captain said to Smalls, who was piloting, "I think we should stop, give up, and you should beach this boat." Smalls said, "Oh no, I think I can make it. I think I can make it. Just be cool. I can make it out of here." But another shell came, and some more destruction. The captain came back to him again and said, "I order you to beach this boat." Smalls said, "Look here, you are a white man, and you're an officer. If we give up and the Confederates catch you, they'll treat you like a gentleman. But we are former slaves. They would show no mercy to us. So not by damn sight will I beach this boat." Then the officer got scared, and he ran from his post. He ran to the coal bin and opened up the coal bin and jumped inside the coal bin and put the top on his head. So at least he wouldn't get hit by any more fire, because this crazy Negro is going to go on through this fire driving his boat. What do you suppose Smalls did? Smalls told one of his buddies, "Take the wheel for a minute." And Smalls ran over to the coal bin and latched it from the outside so the officer couldn't get out. Then Smalls went back to the wheel, and as he said he would do, he delivered the ship into safety. And when he did, the commanding general came to the ship to welcome the crew back. And Smalls said, "Come here," and took the general over to the coal bin, and only then did he unlatch it. As I see there was a coward. He deserted his duty in the midst of battle. Can you imagine this 22-year-old kid talking about an officer like that? So they had no choice. The military dismissed this officer for cowardice and promoted Smalls to be captain of the planter for the rest of the war. And they paid him $150 a month. So that's the short answer to your story, your question.
Okay, my next question was, what federal elective office was he elected to, and what years did he serve?
Smalls was first elected to the US Congress in 1874. He was reelected to the Congress in 1876. But in 1877, Smalls was put on trial, I told you. He was accused of having... In 1877, the Democrats took over the government. The white Democrats took over the government, and the Republicans were put out of office. And Wade Hampton, who was the new governor now, decided to get rid of all of the Republican office holders. There was a judge he got rid of, and he decided to get rid of Smalls from his congressional office. So there were charges against him, and they convicted him, and so on. However, after all that hubbub, they convicted him, and he was on appeal, and so on, Smalls got reelected to Congress 3 more times. Now, part of that is because he was such a great guy, but another part of it is numbers. The black population after the war, the black population before the war, during slavery, was larger than the white population, right? All these blacks on the plantation and a few whites. So after blacks got the right to vote, that meant blacks outnumbered white voters. And in Beaufort County, blacks were 80% of the population. And then, unlike now, the black people really went to the polls and voted. And so they kept reelecting him. And eventually he didn't get reelected. and so on, but for a long time. Even after he was not reelected in about 1880 to the U.S. Congress, he was appointed to a federal position as commissioner for the port of Beaufort, commissioner of customs. And so he had that job for the next 22 years. So he almost always had a federal job once he got elected in 74 because he was such a strong Republican. He was the leader of the Republicans in South Carolina. He went to the Republican National Conventions. He nominated people for president of the United States. He was a powerful political person until 1877 election. You've heard of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise? In 1877, they couldn't decide who was the president because in the Electoral College, the Democrat got a few more votes than Republican Hayes, but not enough to be elected. So the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. So the House had to vote on the matter. And the House voted, and they were deadlocked. It was mainly the North and South, Republicans and Democrats. They were deadlocked. They couldn't decide who was going to be the president. This went on for weeks. No president for weeks. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, there was no governor for weeks. There was an argument about which of these two people were elected governor. But at the national level, when Smalls learned that what discussions were going on, he arranged a meeting with Hayes. He and the black Republicans had campaigned for Hayes, the Republican. They wanted Hayes to be the president, but they didn't like some of the rumors they were hearing. So they went to see the president and said, Mr. President, we know you're not going to do it, but some people are talking about you might agree to become president and withdraw in exchange. You would withdraw federal troops from the South. He said, please don't do that. If we don't have federal troops, we cannot guarantee our rights. The president said, he wasn't president yet. He said, well, I'll think about it and I'll get back to you. But he had already decided, because of the Florida vote made the difference, that he was going to be president and agree to withdraw the troops from the South. So when he withdrew the troops, then Hampton took over as governor, and Smalls kept getting elected to Congress for a while, but some of his power was gone because he was no longer in the majority in the Republican state. Yes, ma'am.
Did he have any collegial or collaborative activity with Joseph Rainey, who was also Congressman?
Joseph Rainey was, I think Rainey. Joseph Rainey, I think, was the first black elected to Congress from South Carolina. Then eventually there were 3 at one time, then there were 4, and altogether there were 8 blacks, not all at the same time, but more blacks elected from South Carolina than any other state. And yes, Smalls was buzzed with all of them. They were colleagues, and they worked together, and they schemed together. But Rainey was a strong leader, and Smalls was a strong supporter of his. Rainey was more senior than Smalls. He was the first black person to get elected. I think that might have been 68 or 70. And Smalls didn't go to Congress until 74. You related to Rainey? That's great. Let's talk about it some more after the election. Because I think, you see, there are these 8 congressmen, and I think all of them deserve the kind of biography I'm giving Robert Smalls. That would give the reality of the history of what the state was like during those turbulent times. Anybody else? Yes, Mae.
In the beginning, you said you thought there was one more book to be written about Smalls, and you hoped one of your students or one of his relatives would write it. And what would that be?
These are the questions that I haven't been able to answer. The first one, who was Smalls' father? Biological father. I finessed it. I discussed it at length in the book, but then I finessed it by saying, we don't know. But I also told you that these 2 families are buried within a few feet apart, right? So some of my students may decide to take this issue up. And now you can do DNA. All you need to do is get relatives on both sides to agree and find the money and you can settle the question. I'd like to know who his father was. And the reason I'd like to know is because I don't believe either one of those white men was Small's biological father. Langston Hughes wrote a book after talking with Carter G. Woodson about famous Negro heroes. And Smalls was one. And he wrote in his book that Smalls' father and mother were slaves on the McKee plantation, and their name was Robert and Lydia Smalls. When I read that, I said, wow. And so you don't know how many years I spent trying to check that out. And I checked all sorts of stuff. I found all sorts of Smallses, but I could find no record. In fact, my ace on these records was the 1870 census, which is the first census of black people in families and so on. And there were Smalls listed in that census, but no Small that would be of the age that could be Robert Small's father. But I think there may be ways of getting around it. I was talking to a group the other day who said, well, maybe he was sold off to another plantation, or maybe they were ashamed of him, or maybe. What happened to a lot of black men who fathered children is that they didn't get credit for it. So that's one line. Who was his father? I'll accept it if it was McKee, particularly since they were such nice people, but I won't accept this guy from Charleston. So that's one question. Another question is, how did Smalls really amass his fortune, and how was he able to hang on to it for so long? Smalls died in 1915, the same year Booker T. Washington died. And Smalls still owned that house. And it stayed in the house and his family for almost 100 years. How could that be in a time of such conflict? The first white person to own that house after the Smalls family called me up one time. He said, I read about you in the paper, and so I just want you to know. No, his wife said, my husband was the first white man to live in that house after the Smalls, and so he wants to talk to you. And so he talked to me about it, and I got lots of notes from him about that, describing the house and so on and so on. So his wealth, I mean, he was a very active businessman, and he was frugal, but still I want to know how he got his wealth. I also want to know what happened to it. I know in a way what happened to his wealth, his legacy, his property. See, he owned not only his house, but he owned half a dozen houses in that neighborhood. And if you know Beaufort, you know it's an upscale neighborhood. It always has been an upscale neighborhood. Now there's only one black family that lives in that neighborhood. But he owned lots of houses in that neighborhood. And he rented them to white families and black families alike. So I want to know what happened. After I'm up to Elizabeth, his older daughter, when she inherited most of the property. And when she died, I don't know what happened. Dolly, my major contact, knows that she got this little house in back of this big house where Robert Smalls lived, which Smalls also owned. And she and her husband stayed there. And she died a couple of years ago and turned it over to the Historical Society. But I just like to know the details of his being. And finally, I have a whole chapter on Smalls' religious background, which helped to make him the kind person he was. And I have a whole chapter on his family, his mother and his owner and all of them raising him in Beaufort. And I have a whole chapter on what happened in Charleston that made him the person he is. But I still don't know completely. So I want some of my students to follow up. And what is it? You see, because there were lots of records that we don't have. In fact, the son, Small's son, who wrote lots of letters to Dorothy Sterling when she was doing her biography, and I got all those letters. They're in the Tulane University archives. There's a lot of stuff in there. And I got some letters from Congress that he wrote, and so on and so on. But the descendants said that when his youngest daughter died, Sarah, that she had all those papers and stuff, and nobody knew what happened to them. So wouldn't it be wonderful if somebody discovered that they're somewhere stacked away? one more story about his, what I'd like to know about. When Smalls got into trouble with the Democrats, and the Democrats closed in and started threatening blacks to keep them from voting, during part of that time, 2 different white Democrats got elected from that district, which I told you was 80% black, right? And 85% Republican. But they scared the people away from the vote, from the polls, and so people began to stop voting. Ron Small's son said he never stopped voting. Nobody could keep him from voting. Anyhow, but a lot other people stopped voting, and so there was some turmoil during that, which I don't yet understand. I got one more. I have not been able to figure out what happened to those 8 men who were on the planter with him. I have not been able to figure out what happened to them. Since they were not as famous, I suppose they didn't keep any records and stuff. But I was talking about this one day recently, and a man in the congregation raised his hand in Beaufort. He said, do you know anything about any of those men? So I told a story about how one man was drowning and Smalls saved him in Philadelphia, and he said, what was the name? I couldn't remember the name all of right now. He said, I think that was my relative who came back to Beaufort. And we've been hearing these stories about how relatives he had been on the ship with Smalls. But anyhow, so I think there's somebody around who knows something, you see, and maybe my students will have the time and energy to find out more. Well, one more question. Is it okay with you if you ask me? Yeah.
You mentioned that when Small was, I guess, on the state regents at the University of South Carolina, he opened up the University of South Carolina for all students.
Yeah, black and white.
My question did it remain open, or did sometime
Good question.
it close? I did basically at Fort Jackson.
Good question.
I used to hang out over there, so that's why I'm curious about it.
Okay, it's great history. You ought to come over there and find out some more about it. Some of those graduates, and particularly from the law school, were just fantastic people. This is what happened. They opened the school up after the Civil War when black Republicans were a majority in the state government. They were never an exclusively black government, but blacks had a majority in the House, and whites had a majority in the Senate, but it was always close enough so that the black majority wielded a lot of influence. The lieutenant governor was always black, and he presided over the Senate. The Speaker of the House was twice black, and he presided over it. So there was a lot of influence there, and they appointed the Board of Regents and so on. However, I told you in about the 1876 election, Democrats took over. And when they took over, they closed down the school. And when they reopened it, it was all white. Until 1963, did they admit black students to the university. Education was his passion. Yes.
I feel like that was such a sad turmoil to end on. As you were talking about Robert Smallman, one of the, all of his great accomplishments, and he was so bright. But I was, one of the themes that makes this a very special story for me is the theme of kindness and public service. And I know that you're also a sociologist. And so my question is, how do you, because you've obviously thought about this a lot, how do you kind of weave the importance of kindness and public service, sociologic manners into your sociologic background? I realize this is a very...
My first thing is his mother. His mother was a remarkable woman. She had lived in the cabin with her mother on the plantation until she was 10 years old, and then the McKees family brought her into the city of Beaufort to be their house servant, which she served for the next 40 years until the Union troops landed in November 1862 and made her free. And all the people in the islands were essentially free. But she was very smart. Her mother had told her about Africa and about her own mother had been captured and brought from Africa. And so she taught her daughter, and she taught Robert Smalls a lot of stuff. In addition to that, because his owner allowed him not only to go around with other children and his own children, but with other slave owners, plantation owners. So Smalls told an inquiring commission after the war about what slavery was like. And he said, I'd sometimes be riding with, he mentioned the name of the slave owner, plantation owner. I'd be riding around the field with him, and he would see a black man doing something that he didn't like. And he would call that man up to the wagon and have him stripped and whipped in front of all the women. He said, my owner never did anything like that to me. So Smalls got to see evil, and he got to see goodness. And he grew up to show his goodness. One other story. He was in the war, and he was asked to come to see the admiral in charge. And when he was taken there, a general named Gilmore, who was down on the boat with Smalls, the Smalls needed to go up to see the admiral. General Gilmore is reported to have said, this boy needs to come up and see the admiral. A northern newspaper reporter was there. And you know how newspaper reporters are, they can get good stories, right? So this newspaper reporter was insulted on behalf of Smalls that Gilmore should call him boy. He said he was not a boy, he was captain of the planter. He did this, he did that. So he wrote his newspaper, he wrote an article about it. They published it in the New York newspaper. A big thing about General Gilmore. It was terrible. And then another newspaper took it up. It was terrible. And for once time, Gilmore thought he might be in danger of losing his post. Because how could he, as a Union general, be talking about somebody as a boy when he didn't do it? He said he didn't do it. So Robert Smalls took up his pen and wrote a letter to the New York Times and said, General Gilmore has been kind to me ever since I've been in the service, both private and in person. And he's a wonderful man, and y'all leave him alone. And they left him alone. Smalls did not say that Gilmore didn't call him boy. You know, he just said that's, he probably did, but, and a lot worse things, but he just took up for him, absorbed him, and so he stayed on in his commission. I won't keep you any longer because you won't be able to buy any books if I don't let you go. That'd be self-defeating.
Well, then please join us out in the lobby. I want you to first join us in thanking Andrew Billingsley.
My first thing is his mother. His mother was a remarkable woman. She had lived in the cabin with her mother on the plantation until she was 10 years old, and then the McKees family brought her into the city of Beaufort to be their house servant, where she served for the next 40 years until the Union troops landed in November 1862 and made her free. And all the people in the islands were free. But she was very smart. Her mother had told her about